In this episode, we're back in pre-Islamic times, and we're going to be examining the fact that there were Jews before the Prophet ﷺ who were expecting the advent of another prophet. In this video, we're going to be looking at that through the lens of the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, that there were Jews, especially in the first century, that understood Deuteronomy 18 to be about a future prophet who had not arisen yet. Of course, I'm sure you guys are aware of the prophecy in Deuteronomy 18. God promises that I will raise them up a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth. Now, Deuteronomy itself, the Torah itself, it ends by setting up the expectation that this prophet will arise in the future, because the Torah ends by saying that no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. So it is categorically denying that a prophet like Moses has arisen. So of course, no surprise, there were Jews who would read this and they would remember that God had promised a prophet like Moses would come. So they would read this and go, well, if a prophet like Moses has not come yet, then he must come in the future. So when we go to the first century, we see this expectation. It's no surprise. We see it, for example, in the Gospel of John. There are Jews who come to John the Baptist and they ask him, who are you? And John the Baptist, he says, I am not the Messiah. Then the Jews ask, well, who are you? Are you Elijah? And he says, I am not. And then they ask, are you the prophet? And he says no. So the Jews were expecting three figures, the Messiah, Elijah, and the prophet in the story. And clearly then, Jews at that time had this expectation that a future prophet, a specific future prophet, was supposed to arise. And we see this again in John 7. The crowd disagrees about Jesus. Some of them say, this is really the prophet, and others say, no, this is the Messiah. So there were Jews at that time who were expecting the prophet as well as the Messiah, and clearly they viewed these figures to be different figures. They didn't think the Messiah was the prophet. They didn't think Elijah was the Messiah, was the prophet. They viewed these as different figures. Now, in our discussion today, we're not discussing whether the Gospel of John thinks Jesus is that prophet. We're just extracting the fact that there were Jews at the time who believed that this future prophet would arise. We also see this expectation in Qumran. So 1QS 911, it says, until the coming of the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. Now, who is the prophet mentioned here, who they were expecting was going to arrive? Well, there's another text, 4Q175, testimonial. Now, if we go to this text, we see that they quote Deuteronomy 18, they quote Numbers 24, and they quote Deuteronomy 33. So Deuteronomy 18, which is quoted here, is clearly what forms the expectation for the coming of the prophet. Numbers 24 is then quoted next, which talks about a scepter coming out of Israel, so a future figure coming out of Israel. That is clearly where the expectation of the Messiah of Israel comes from. And then Deuteronomy 33 is a promise to Levi, from which come the descendants of Aaron. So that is where they got the expectation of the Messiah of Aaron from. So it's not a coincidence that this text quotes Deuteronomy 18, Numbers 24, and Deuteronomy 33, and the previous text talks about the coming of the prophet and the messiahs of Aaron and Israel. This text clearly shows us that the prophet they were expecting was the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. We see further evidence for this expectation in the first century in Josephus. Now, in this dissertation on the prophet like Moses, the author on pages 294 to 295 quotes a number of passages from Josephus where Josephus is describing how multiple false prophets arose around the first century. And if you look at the details that Josephus gives us about their lives, it seems like many of them were setting themselves up to look like a new Moses, to look like a prophet like Moses. So, for example, he tells us about Theodos, and he says, this impostor claimed to be a prophet and persuaded many to take their possessions and follow him to the Jordan, which he claimed he would divide. So the idea of splitting the sea is obviously like Moses. He also tells us about deceivers and seducers who claim to be divinely inspired. They led a crowd into the wilderness, promising that God would there show them signs of freedom. Now, this is similar to Moses, of course, because Moses led Israel into the wilderness and God showed them signs there, and Moses freed them from Pharaoh. He also tells us about the Egyptian, and he says that this Egyptian false prophet, he led 30,000 men from the wilderness to the Mount of Olives and planned an attack on Jerusalem. And of course, this is similar to Moses, who led them out from Egypt through the wilderness into the promised land. Of course, Joshua completed it, but the point is into the promised land, and of course, they engaged in battles there as well. He also tells us that this prophet promised his followers that at his command, the walls of Jerusalem would fall down, which is interesting, and we'll discuss that a bit later. He also also tells us about another impostor, and he says a certain impostor promised salvation and freedom from misery if people would follow him into the wilderness. Again, Moses freed the people from Pharaoh and he led them through the wilderness. He also tells us about another false prophet who claimed that God commanded the people to go into the temple court where they would receive signs of deliverance. And he was one of many prophets proclaiming that the people should wait for help from God. So again, the idea of signs of deliverance. Finally, he tells us about Jonathan, who led not a few of the poor into the desert, promising signs and apparitions. And again, this is like Moses, who led Israel through the wilderness, and God showed them signs in the wilderness. Now, regarding these sorts of false prophets, Dale Allison mentions in his book, The New Moses, a Matthean Typology, on pages 81 to 82. In first century Palestine, there were ostensible prophets who, following a more or less fixed scenario, led people into the desert, where miracles of deliverance like those of Moses and his imitator Joshua were to be enacted. In view of the clear application of Deuteronomy 18:15 and 18 to an eschatological prophet like Moses in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament, in view of the evident prominence of the figures themselves, they were prophets and leaders who had not only great popular appeal, but the authority to command their followers at risk of death. And in view of the New Testament's testimony that popular opinion often settled upon prophet or the Mosaic prophet as explanation for out-of-the-ordinary religious activity, why resist the inference that Theodos, the Egyptian, and the hapless others like them provoke speculation regarding the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18:15 and 18? It is no effective retort that the works of Josephus never say as much. Had Deuteronomy 18:15 and 18 indeed helped precipitate revolutionary movements, Josephus's apologetical interests would have led him to feign of the fact ignorance. So it is true that Josephus never says explicitly that they apply Deuteronomy 18 to themselves, but the fact that they are seemingly portraying themselves as similar to Moses means it's very likely that they themselves or many of their followers thought that they were fulfilling Deuteronomy 18. And of course, all this helps us extract the point that there were Jews in the first century who were expecting an eschatological prophet like Moses. And it seems perhaps there were a lot of them because these false prophets had a lot of followers. We also know that even today, the Samaritan Jews are expecting the prophet like Moses to arrive in the future. And there is actually some evidence that this is an early pre-Islamic view among the Samaritans. So if you go to the pseudo-Clementine literature, it talks about the Samaritans and it says, "Now they do correctly await the one prophet who is to come to erect and establish unknown things just as Moses predicted. These fell into schisms through the cunning of Josephus." Now, as Origen mentions, Josephus was actually someone who came to the Samaritans and claimed to be the prophet like Moses. Quote, "Josephus the Samaritan also wished to persuade the Samaritans that he was the Christ predicted by Moses, and he appears to have gained over some to his views." Now, although the Samaritan conception of who this prophet will be is not exactly the same as Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, they have some extra traditions about him. The point is that the Samaritans read from Deuteronomy 18 that there is going to be a future eschatological prophet to arrive. Now, the Jews of Medina were also expecting the coming of an eschatological prophet. The Ansar, who lived with the Jews in Medina, had been warned by those Jews beforehand that a prophet was arising. Ibn Ishaq, for example, mentions that the Ansar, who lived with the Jews in Medina, were warned by the Jews beforehand that a prophet was going to arise. So for example, in this narration it mentions, "Now God had prepared the way for Islam in that they lived side by side with the Jews, who were people of the scriptures and knowledge, while they themselves were polytheists and idolaters. They had often raided them in their district, and whenever bad feeling arose, the Jews used to say to them, 'A prophet will be sent soon. His day is at hand. We shall follow him and kill you by his aid as Ad and Iram perished.' So when they heard the apostles' message, they said to one another, 'This is the very prophet of whom the Jews warned us. Don't let them get to him before us.' Thereupon they accepted his teaching and became Muslims." And this is authentic. So with that all out of the way, I just want to take the opportunity to speak a little bit more about Deuteronomy 18 itself. Well, first of all, we know from Deuteronomy 34 that a prophet like Moses had not arisen in Israel. If Deuteronomy 34 is from Moses, as the traditional opinion goes, that is a categorical denial that the prophet like Moses will arise from Israel, so he has to arise then outside of Israel. Now again, many people try and say that Deuteronomy 18 is not about a specific prophet, but it's about all the prophets, but this goes against Deuteronomy 34, which denies that there was ever a prophet like Moses in Israel. And again, if Moses is writing this, saying there will never be a prophet like Moses in Israel, so clearly Deuteronomy 18 cannot be about prophets in general. And Numbers 12 actually proves this as well, because if you read Numbers 12, God says, "When there are prophets among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. Not so with my servant Moses. He is entrusted with all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord." So there is something special about Moses. He is different. He is unique as compared to the other prophets. That's why God speaks to him directly, whereas he speaks to the other prophets in visions and dreams. So Moses is superior to the other prophets, and he has this unique gift where God spoke to him face to face. And this actually means that the prophet like Moses is both going to speak face to face to God, but also the main way he's going to receive revelation, as Deuteronomy 18 says, is that God is going to put his words in the prophet's mouth. And this is wonderfully realized and fulfilled in the prophet Muhammad ﷺ, because the main way that he received revelation was that Allah put his words in Muhammad's mouth ﷺ, but he still spoke to the prophet Muhammad ﷺ face to face, meaning directly on the night of Isra, where Allah again spoke to the Prophet Muhammad directly. And again, the phrase face to face is just an expression, which means that God spoke to Moses directly. Now, another thing that I want to cover is the fact that some people try and deny that Deuteronomy 34 is referencing Deuteronomy 18, but this is a very weak argument. And David DeYoung, in chapter 5 of his book on the prophet like Moses, on pages 123 to 124, actually gives us some good reasons to think that Deuteronomy 34 is referencing Deuteronomy 18. He says, "In my view, Deuteronomy 34:10 is both dependent on and a qualification of the promise of the prophet like Moses of Deuteronomy 18:15 to 18. First, these texts are the only passages in the Hebrew Bible that explicitly designate Moses as a prophet, Navi. Second, the passages use the uncommon formulation of Navi plus Qum, along with a comparison to Moses." So what he's saying here is very significant. First of all, Deuteronomy 18 and Deuteronomy 34 are the only passages in the Torah which call Moses a Navi, a prophet. Yes, other passages imply that he's a prophet, but that title is only given to him in Deuteronomy 18 and 34. And outside of the Torah, he is still never called a Navi in the entire Hebrew Bible, except one passage in Hosea, where it is implied that Moses is being talked about, and it calls him a prophet explicitly. But he's not counting that because it doesn't explicitly name Moses, but it's obviously about Moses. So the fact that in both passages Moses is called a Navi, plus the fact that the same verb is used, kum, and the fact that both passages have the comparison to Moses, like you, all of these factors indicate that Deuteronomy 34 is clearly referencing Deuteronomy 18. So again, it's important to note that God says that the prophet will be like Moses. He doesn't just say that I will raise them up a prophet. He specifically says that the prophet is going to be like Moses. So there's an obvious difference. If God just wanted to speak about prophets in general rising up, he would have just said, I will raise them up a prophet. But the fact that he said he's going to be like Moses means he's going to be unique like Moses. It's like the difference between saying a scientist will come and saying a scientist like Einstein will come. And by the way, James D. Bales made this point. So obviously, if you say someone is a scientist like Einstein, you have a very different picture in mind than if someone just says, oh yeah, that guy is a scientist. And remember, at the time of Moses, there were other prophets. In Exodus 20, when this prophecy was originally given, Aaron and Miriam were alive. Later on, in the time of Deuteronomy 18, other prophets were alive, like Joshua. There were 70 other prophets who had the spirit of prophecy that was put on them at one point. And of course, there were prophets before Moses and there were prophets after Moses. Yet God specifically said that this prophet will be like Moses. And this prophecy is given to Moses during the events of Exodus 20. And in those events, during those events, Moses is literally exhibiting his unique features. He's talking to God face to face. He's receiving a covenant from God. He's receiving the law. These unique features are literally being exhibited by Moses in Exodus 20 when God gave him this prophecy. And we know that this prophecy was given to Moses during the events of Exodus 20 because Deuteronomy 18 verses 16 onwards make it clear. Now, the fact that this promise was actually given to Moses during the events of Exodus 20 once again proves that the promise is about one prophet, not multiple prophets, because there's nothing in the context of Exodus 20 which would make us think that even though God spoke about the prophet in the singular, somehow it's about multiple prophets. So if you go to the Samaritan Pentateuch, you do find this promise in the context of Exodus 20. And it doesn't matter if this is the original text or not, because again, Moses in Deuteronomy 18:16 onwards makes clear that this event where God told him this promise about a prophet like Moses, that this happened during the events of Exodus 20. So Moses is Moses' own words in Deuteronomy 18 prove that this event happened at Exodus 20. So let's take a look now at the Samaritan version of Exodus 20. And Shema spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the voice of the words of this people which they have spoken to you. They have well said all that they have spoken. Oh, that there were such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brothers, like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I shall command him. And then it goes on, and then it gives the test of how to determine who is a true prophet or not. But you can see there's clearly nothing in this context which makes you think that even though God spoke about the prophet like Moses in the singular, somehow he's talking about multiple prophets. The final thing I just want to touch on is the difference between the Masoretic text of chapter 18 verse 15 and the Samaritan text of chapter 18 verse 15. So the Masoretic text, it says that the prophet will come from your midst, from your brothers, whereas the Samaritan version says that the prophet will rise up from the midst of your brothers. So the Samaritan version actually agrees with verse 18, where God says that he will raise up the prophet from the midst of their brothers. Now, I would say that the Masoretic text is wrong because, number one, it's odd, it's strange, it's weird. It says that the prophet will rise up from your midst, from your brothers. So there's a doubling of from X, from group X, from group Y. It is strange. A double from is weird, whereas the Samaritan text is not odd at all. Secondly, the Masoretic text is contradictory because it says that the prophet is going to arise from your midst, but then says he's going to arise from your brothers. So from your midst implies he's going to come out from the midst of Israel. From your brothers implies he's going to come out from the midst of a brother nation. And we have, of course, discussed how from your brothers implies a brother nation in many other places. I'm not going to go over that again. And we have responded to the objection elsewhere that Deuteronomy 17 disproves the argument that from your brothers means a brother nation, because we've mentioned that the law of kings in Deuteronomy 17 is not Mosaic. Finally, for the Masoretic version of this verse, we can very easily imagine why this change would have been made. We can very easily imagine that the scribe had a nationalistic motive. He wanted to take this prophecy, which maybe he thought it was about an Israelite, but he wanted to make it even more clear that it's about an Israelite, so he made that change. Or maybe he read Deuteronomy 34 and he said, wow, this may make people think that Deuteronomy 18 is not actually about an Israelite, so let me make it more clear it's about an Israelite. Or maybe he read it and he thought, well, this text is about a Gentile prophet, let me change it and make it an Israelite prophet. So we can very easily imagine a nationalistic theological motive for the change. Plus, again, the reading is odd and contradictory, so the MT text should be rejected. And even if you think that the Masoretic text is more likely on text critical grounds, there's nothing definitive against the Samaritan version of the text. And by the way, it should also be noted that the Greek Septuagint was also translating from a Hebrew text that had from the midst of your brothers. It's obvious if you look at the Septuagint's rendering of that verse. So that is another attestation that this reading was there. So again, the point of this video is that there were Jews before the coming of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ who knew that another prophet had to arise, the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. And they were expecting his coming, especially in the first century. But also the Jews in Medina knew that a prophet was going to arise. And then, of course, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was raised up by God and he fulfilled the prophecy of Moses.